Hey, hey, hey. Hi. You guys braved the cold. She said it. I'm Angélique Roché. You were at Very Biggest Questions. If anyone wasn't supposed to be here, you can't leave now. Sorry. You're stuck. But thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm very excited because we're going to be delving into a very big question tonight. Do we still need faith in the 21st century? And those of you who know I love Marvel know that I love saying things like Avengers Assemble. We have assembled a very amazing crew of folks. But first, I kind of want to set the tone, right? Faith saturates everything we do, right? Whether it's faith in religion, faith in a partner, faith in a government system, faith that your neighbor is going to curb their dog this time, faith that you're going to get to the MTA and the conductor saw you running down the steps and you're not going to be late for that 9:15 meeting that you need to leave 30 seconds before you did to get to the train. Faith literally is omnipresent, right? Well, I'm going to do a little audience participation just to wake you up a little bit. How many of you in this room were raised in some form of institutionalized religion, whether it's part of the three, Christianity, Muslim, Jewish, or not, institutionalized religion? Okay, I want you to keep your hands up if you still practice any form of religion. Now, keep your hands up if you still practice the form of religion that you were raised in. Oh yeah, y'all are proving some points. Now, raise your hand if you believe to your core, religious or not, that you are a person of faith. All right. Almost all of you who had your hands up. Well, it's interesting because, and judgment-free zone, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on me. I was raised Catholic, like very Catholic. This is me in my Catholic school uniform thinking I was cool. In fact, I was raised so Catholic that I have two middle names. The second one is Rose, after Rose of Vetrebo, who is more mystic than really saint. She foretold that the emperor was going to die at a young age, and then she converted an entire town of people from a sorceress and converted the sorceress, because women get things done, while by standing in a pyre for 3 hours and not dying. At 17 years old, and probably the reason why I chose her as my patron saint, this was the coolest thing I had heard of in the 12 years of Catholic school since being raised from the dead. I did not tell the bishop that on my confirmation day. Nor did I tell my parents that, who my mother was insistent that I chose as Saint Rose, because her name is Rose. But I, like most Louisianians, also grew up with a lot of folklore. I grew up with the mysticism that comes with being from South Louisiana, including voodoo. In fact, for my 8th grade social studies project, I did it on Marie Laveau. This is me in St. Louis Cemetery number 1, taking pictures of an unmarked grave. My mother was very supportive. If you're wondering, I got second place in the social studies fair. I do believe I was robbed. It's totally fine. Meanwhile, I graduated from Catholic school, and while voodoo, yes, this is me at my Catholic school graduation, all in white, getting my diploma from a nun. And while voodoo did not kind of shake my faith, going into the real world did. Realizing that there were things like the Apocrypha and the American Standard Bible was different than the King James Bible, that they were different biblical translations, that there were holy books that were inspired, but not in my Bible, that Shakespeare helped translate the King James Bible. All of these things shook my faith. And so I took a step back from the church, and I went on an epic journey, because everything in your 20s is epic. Everything. And, you know, after feeling like 2 decades of my life I'd been lied to, I started studying other faiths, the Baha'i faith, Islam. I looked at voodoo. I looked at orishas and loas. I looked at the idea of intention setting and candle magic. In fact, I almost converted to Islam for a moment. But all those things were rooted in my belief that I had grown up in. And I was trying to find out what I believed in and why I believed it. And so I asked myself epic questions that 20-year-olds ask themselves. How does my faith reconcile with my politics and my autonomy? Wasn't Jesus merciful and empathetic, full of compassion and love? How could the Bible justify things like slavery, the Holocaust, the KKK? Was I looking at faith in the right way? I still don't really know that answer, but today I own no less than 6 Bibles, a Quran, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, many books from the Baha'i faith, as well as I have an altar in my house, candles full of intentions. I am still a practicing Catholic, and I still contemplate this idea of what does faith mean in the 21st century? Do we still need faith in the 21st century? So that brings us to our question tonight. You see that? A little bit of a round. In a world where there's ever-increasing technology, where knowledge is at your fingertips, compounded with increasing tragedies 24/7, where the news cycle is continuous post-industrial revolution, you have supercomputers literally sitting on your laps right now. We are ever connected to the internet, and we're plugged into this seemingly endless parade of diametrically opposed political opinions and religious beliefs. There are hypocritical optics everywhere, including inside of religious institutions. And whether or not it is connected, we have seen a sharp decline in religious institutional congregations. And we've seen the birth of smaller congregations. We've also seen the resurgence of folks returning to more traditional polytheistic and pagan practices like voodoo, Santeria, and the duotheism of Wicca. Needless to say, faith is complicated. And needless to say, it is far-reaching and nuanced. But tonight, we are going to keep it a little bit on the smaller scale, if we can. We really only have 6 panelists, so we're not going to touch everything. And we're going to talk about the history of faith, the idea. We've got 2 amazing, brilliant folks who are going to come out in a moment, who are going to talk about their work in educating and within education within the faith space. We're going to talk about faith in practice. More particularly how it relates to interpersonal relationships, policy, and even progressive ideals. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the alternative practices outside of what some would consider monotheistic religion. And we're going to talk about what is the difference between religion, faith, and practices. So that's enough for me, right? You guys ready for the first panelist? I did not believe any of you. Are you ready for the first panelist? Great. I would like to bring to the stage Reverend Dr. Theresa Thames and Dr. Hussein Rashid. All right, so both of you, I'm going to switch mics. Hi. Oh, there we go. Do you want to test that mic out?
Sure. Does it sound all right?
I mean, ask them. Does it sound all right?
Does it sound all right? Okay.
Great. Guys, I tell corny jokes, and there are going to be lots of puns. You can ask. One of my podcast partners is actually in the audience. She's cringing. So y'all have really long bios, and I didn't read them for the sake of embarrassment on how brilliant you are. Literally, both of you have an embarrassment of riches on the work that you've done. Theresa, we've known each other for a while now. You're at Princeton, you're an associate dean, but before that you were pastor, and before that you were just your fabulous human self and did other lots of things. Hussein, you started a whole organization and like you go out there and educate people on religious respect, tolerance, and really this idea of thwarting stereotypes and bridging the gaps, as well as you're a nerd.
I am. I will lean hard into that.
And you wrote a book on Kamala Khan.
Edited.
Edited. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
Yes. I didn't write the whole book. I only wrote a chapter.
I mean, that's more than most of us. So I kind of want to... I hate to start on heavy, but this is kind of a heavy topic.
Let's do it.
And I know both of you, you're such like, they're light and fluffy, happy people. Like both of these people are just love their work and what they do. And I don't know how you do it. Because there is just this idea of a continuous conversation of what is faith. And so first question, and for the panelists listening in the green room, I'm going to ask this to you too, so no cheating. What does the word faith mean to you?
For me, it's believing in something bigger than myself. I think I'm more poly-religious than I am. I identify as Christian, but I think about my source of faith and inspiration comes from so many spectrums of identities and praxis. And so for faith, it's definitely something that anchors me, that's bigger than me, that's ancient, that's contemporary, that's past, that's future. And that's a very meta answer, but it's the truth.
I think it's a very appropriate answer for the evening. Hussein?
So coming as a Muslim, right? So I wear two hats. One is a scholar of religion and one is a faithful Muslim. And so for me, faith is really being very uncomfortable with uncertainty. That the more we know, it should humble us into what we don't know. And that should always keep us striving for something beyond what we can comprehend. And that's always the act of faith is we use this language of unveiling of secrets. So the more we know that there's more to be known. And that's faith, is that uncertainty.
So, Theresa, and I will guide some of these questions. Religion and the freedom of religion is something that is constitutionally part of this country. It is something that is so foundational in who we are and to the fact that it is in writing. But it would not be incorrect to say that religion has always been part of our culture, not just part of our laws, right?
Right.
How do you think that has evolved over time?
You know, it's messy. America has a messy history with religion. We fled England because we did not want bishops. We did not want religion dictating our day-to-day life and engagement. And then we get to America and it's like, somebody needs to be in charge. And we put religion in place to create, as a womanist, as a feminist, as a Black woman, I think about how religion has been used to create docile bodies, especially for Black and brown and Native people. And so the way that religion is weaved in is more around policing and governing than it is really a faith practice. And so America has this complicated, the Constitution doesn't say anything about God, but the way that we live out our laws and our money, it's governed by this way of ownership and how to create control. So religion has been used in America more so for control than it has been about faith and practice.
And I think that's an interesting point, and I really want to hit on what you said, and this is open to both of you. In your own words, what is the difference between religion and faith?
Religion for me is institutions. It is a way that we have I was about to say commodify, but that's true too. We've commodified, but also the way that we've organized around personalities, around the way people practice or the way people believe. Faith is beyond religion, beyond a particular way of doing it. Religion is the way, the faith is the action of how you do it for me.
Yeah. And I don't know if I think that's such a wonderful distinction. I think what I would do is just have us think about the fact that we are talking about faith as an individual private practice or understanding versus religion as a communal large one. And so when we come to questions of control, it is really about, well, what is this organization we're putting together? And in the American context, how have we understood religion, or how has religion been tied to questions of white supremacy, colonial power? As we sit on Lenape land right now, how was that articulated as part of a religious mission? As we think about enslavement, how is that articulated as part of a religious mission? As we enter the third year of the Muslim ban, how is that part of a religious mission, right? And I think we've got to understand the ways in which that, in ways we think of race as unmarked, we also think of certain religions as unmarked when we talk about these things. So think about how those organizations come together, I think, is really important.
And that's a really good segue into my next question is, like, for most people, the idea of religion in the United States has been seen through a Christian lens. And it really has been, a quote unquote, from perspective-wise, the more dominant religion in the United States. But that's not always been the case around the world, throughout history. But I also want to talk about how other faiths besides Christianity have evolved in the U.S. and that impact on the larger conversation. Yeah, I left it really open.
That was a nice one. So somebody who works on the academic side on Muslims in American popular culture, there really has been, I think there's a real difficulty in trying to articulate religions outside of a Christian lens, right? This idea that people call me up and say, well, will you take part in our protest that demands radical love? Well, that's great, and I think radical love is important if you're a certain type of Christian. But as a Shi'i Muslim, what I lean into is the language of justice, right? Justice is a particular understanding of faith that says you can't have love unless there's equality. You don't get equality unless there's justice. And so you can't get to love until we acknowledge the fact that we've got to fight for something else. But how do I even explain that to somebody who thinks they're doing something wonderful by inviting me to participate in a conversation on radical love? And I don't want to dismiss that because I understand where they're coming from. But is anybody even thinking about, well, what happens if you're not Christian as we're participating in these religious conversations?
And this is kind of for both of you. Do you feel like that complexity, particularly when you're dealing inside and outside of the Christian lens, does have an impact on people's ability to hold on to their faith?
Absolutely. Because Christianity is the default, when we think about religion in America, we immediately think about Christianity. So much so that it impacts the practice of other faith, the way that we, everything's closed on Christmas. How do we observe Ramadan? How do we observe Shabbat? I mean, the way that there's this default of Christianity first. And so it impedes on other people's ability to practice other traditions. On Christmas Eve, a rabbi in our community died. And the newspaper article says, "Rabbi dies on Christmas Eve." And it's like that's problematic, And I'm in a university setting, and what do we do for really thinking about observant students? How do they do their exams when it's Ramadan? Like this idea of the default around everything in this culture. Is Christianity the same way that the default around how we see people is through this white lens as well? And so it's this whitewashing and this Christian washing that impacts how we engage with one another and also how people are able to explicitly practice their faith. And it's from, the last thing I'll say, it's even from the way that we adorn our bodies. When you see people who choose to cover or choose not to cover, or across the spectrum, not only for Muslim or Jewish, but across the spectrum, there's this judgment that's based on our Christian ideas, of this Judeo-Christian ideas of what people should be wearing on their bodies or how people should engage. And so it's limiting when we think about the permission that we give people or the way that we don't give people permission.
And I think it's interesting, coupled with kind of what I talked about in my intro, which is this idea of knowledge and technology, right? Faith, religion, by definition, helps you explain the unexplainable. It helps you, as you said, deal with the uncertainty and realize the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But as our society has evolved, we've kind of eaten from the tree. Christian analogy, but we've kind of eaten from the tree of knowledge, and this idea that, you know, the more knowledge we get, the more many people feel like there aren't uncertainties, like there aren't unknowns, like they know too much in a 24/7 news cycle, whether it's true or not, it's up for debate. But do you still believe that faith is, and I think based on both your answers earlier, do you still believe that is what faith is? Or do you believe that it has evolved with the access to so much knowledge?
So I'm going to take off the study of religion hat and put on the theological hat, again, coming from a Muslim perspective. And for us, right, the Quran tells us repeatedly that in all of creation are signs to understand God. So the more you know of creation, the more you know of God, you know. And so when I remember I was in high school and the Human Genome Project was a big thing, right? So the more we know about human DNA and the more knowledge we have there, the more that should open ourselves up to senses of wonder and awe. If we're going to launch a mission to Mars and colonize Mars and all the technology that comes with that, that should open us up to a sense of wonder and awe. And that increase in knowledge should say, okay, I can now ask better questions of my own faith. It's this constant peeling back of these layers of the unknown that have us thinking, okay, what's the next unknown thing I need to be thinking about? So for me, the position I come from is that intellect and faith are connected. You can't have faith without intellect. You can't have intellect without faith. They go hand in hand. And I think that, and here I'm going to, speaking of Christian language, but I'm going to paraphrase Annie Lamott. You may know this quote better, but where she says the opposite of faith is not doubt, but is certainty. You know, and I think that that's a trap that a lot of people keep falling into. And I think even people who claim to be religious is like, I know an answer, and that an answer kills faith, right? There's no other way, because when a different answer comes along, what happens to that faith? You haven't established a faith. You haven't created an individual who's comfortable with the unknown, but you said, I need an answer. You've created a computer that walks on two legs.
Amen. I am scared of people who have it all figured out. For those who aren't able to have their faith questioned, those who are completely shut off from asking more questions or investigating, those are dangerous people. And I agree with everything that you said, that I am a stronger Christian because I engage with so many other communities that inform my faith and so many different practices that inform my Christianity. And so for me to ask why I believe really helps me to believe even more. So it's hard when you are not able to engage in a dialogue across difference with people when they're so shut off to hearing anything else. That's a dangerous person.
So I want to bring it back to religion for a second, because I realize that I love this conversation, so I'm learning the parameters as we go. Theresa is the Associate Dean of Religious Life and the Chapel at Princeton for the last 4 years. Congratulations. And a pastor in D.C. before that. Do you believe that people seek out religion for moral guidelines more than they seek it out for spiritual guidance, or vice versa?
I actually think that people seek religion for community. We are communal people. We do not want to be alone. And as interconnected as we are, people are desperately lonely. And so we find ourselves in religious communities and Bible studies and in yoga studios, in all the ways that this fostering of I am not alone. And from there, I think that people grow in their faith. And so it's communal. When I was in DC is a very transient city. People are coming from all over. They just want to go to a place where people know their names. And then they have questions about the faith. And then they want to become member. I mean, so it's this progression. Yeah. But people want community.
So in this world, and I want to ask this question because we are going to go short on time, and I could have this conversation for another hour. To piggyback on that, and this is for both of you, in this time where we're living with morality that seems to exist outside of the church, right? Fair trade, eco-friendly, consumer conscious, where it may have at some point in time been rooted in ideals that came from religious texts, these moral guidelines. Equality is questionable, but when you have people who are here outside the purely religious text, do we lose something when we remove religion from the equation?
I don't know if we lose something, but I think the conversation is driven by very different ideas. So if I think what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family taught, or what is in the Quran about the accumulation of wealth and how we should deal with wealth, right? It's a real indictment of the way capitalism is practiced today. And so a lot of, if we talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of them are a response to where capitalism has brought us now. And I would argue that what religion offered is a critique of capitalism before we got to this point. And so are the SDGs moral? I believe they do contain kernels of morality. Are they tied to religion? No. But they're also defined by the system as it exists and don't actually imagine a world that could be without the systems that lead to questions of classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, whatever you want to do, right? Which are so intimately tied to the ways we've we've decided to structure our societies. God, that lost all impact, didn't it? But I think that what religion does at its best, and here I'm going to speak very specifically from a Muslim perspective, what it does at its best is offer critiques of the problems before they become problems and give us an alternative vision before we get to the point where we need to be reactive.
Theresa, anything to add?
Yeah, just for me, as a Christian, the radical liberative message of the gospel is about radical freedom and hospitality that we cannot wrap our minds around. And so when church starts feeling like a social club or the Kiwanis Club, it does lose a bit of, it goes to this feel-good mechanism then when it's about you, and it loses this liberative, radical liberation and justice focus that's centered in a Christ for Christians that risked it all the way to death. And so for me, it's my freedom is tied up into the freedom and liberation of all around me, regardless of what they believe. And me just recycling or wearing a t-shirt or tweeting my picture of me showing up at a rally, that's not enough. How far am I willing to go? Because for me, it's centered in a gospel of radical liberation. And that's what the Kiwanis Club and all the other good social justice things, that's what it's missing.
Oh, I want to ask this last question, but you gotta sum it up in a one word for me.
Okay.
And you're not gonna like that directive. You're smiling right now. Pop culture, politics, Pew Research that says decrease in congregations, all of it. Your honest opinion, what does the future look like for faith and religion in the United States? I'll give you 2 words. You can have a sentence.
I was like, my 2 words are death to institutions. I think denominationalism and all of these barriers and boundaries, they will disappear. And people will still seek out a larger truth, will still seek out community. The pews will be empty in church buildings that keep people out. They should be.
I have a slightly different perspective in that I think the future for religion in the United States will see religions survive that have a story to tell that is their own, that isn't tied to structures of power, that isn't tied to making sure that the organization survives,
Yes.
but that are organized around questions of faith that create community, that offer to change the world, that are authentic to those religions. And I think that's going to take some time because people are afraid to say the world has changed and we weren't there to change it.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to one more round of applause, and then we're going to bring out our next panelist. Thank you. Oh, man. So we got a little history. We got a little background. We have a little bit of a foundation. Our next two panelists, I'm very excited to bring out because we're going to talk a little bit about form and function, interreligious cooperation, interfaith conversations and dialogue. And I think that first conversation was a perfect prime for this because the next step is how do we interact if faith is needed? I would like to bring out Joyce Dubensky, who is the CEO of Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and Maggie Siddiqi, who is the Director of Faith and Progressive Policy, the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
You guys, both of you have immense careers. You both do some very important work across the board in bringing together folks and having dialogues. But the first thing I do want to ask you, because I promised that I would ask everyone, what does the word faith mean to you?
Well, I have a personal definition, and then I don't have a general one. I have found that there are many different definitions and many different ways that people define the word faith and the words religion. So I can only speak for myself. And for me, I think faith is my way of believing in the universe.
Maggie?
I think I'd echo what some of the first panel was saying, and I do think there's sort of an individual element to it, and it is a commitment, I would say, to something that is beyond this world.
Mm. So I'm just going to hit it. What does...
Oh, good.
I got you. I promised. What does the practice of faith look like today? Yeah, it's very broad. Both of you work, and I'll kind of layer this on. Both of you work across the board with folks of different denominations, different religions, different sects.
Mm-hmm.
But you also both work. Joyce, your organization is secular, and is non-sectarian. There's not a denomination, and Maggie, there is a particular directive in your work to safeguard against the different parts of establishment versus religious freedom, and ensure that religious freedoms exist while working across the board. Folks who do not all the time agree. So that being said, what does that look like today? What does the practice of faith look like today from your perspective within your work?
Well, I think what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing, is that it's really the same as it's always been. Religion, faith are hugely powerful forces in people's lives, in our communities, and today it's in our public square. And it affects everything. And so it's both positive and negative. It can be used and is used destructively. And it can be used and is drawn upon to inspire and create fabulous collective action. And so on the positive note, You've seen the growth of what was once an interfaith movement and then, a multi-faith movement. I now would like to think of it as a multi-belief movement. And there's a proliferation of efforts that you see, at least in this country, but also in other countries, where people are doing this. And in practical ways, one of the things that I know is that, we work with people who are called, we call religious peacemakers in action. And they're religiously driven individuals. They're not all clergy. They're, people like me, people like you. And they're in armed conflicts. And they're in some of the most intractable conflicts in the world. And they are choosing to work for peace because they have a vision of what a lived peace can be. And we have them, and they work together. And so we have 28 of them that we work with, and that's pretty powerful stuff, and that's real world and happening every day.
I think we're in a really interesting time right now because what I'm seeing is, again, echoing what we heard from some of the last panel, a decline in faith in institutions, but not necessarily a decline in faith.
Right. We had this conversation with this idea of a la carte religion.
Yes.
And this concept that folks may not be in the structure of the church, going off of what Theresa just said, or they may be outside the structures of the church, but that does not mean that they are not part of a religion.
Right. And I think we're seeing people coming together in faith communities in ways that we haven't seen as much of before. I'm somebody who doesn't go to a mosque regularly, even though I'm very much a person of faith. A lot of my religious community happens in people's homes and in very intentional ways. And I think a lot of the way people live out their faith now, partly to Joyce's point as well, is in sort of living out their values through things like community organizing or other types of activism. When I look at, just from the spaces that are most relevant to my work in the political space, progressive movements, and particularly those that are led by people of color, tend to be so infused with faith traditions in a way that is completely organic to how they organize and how they show up. When our immigration team at the Center for American Progress wanted to kind of mark the day when the Supreme Court was hearing the court case on DACA, on Dreamers. The way that the Dreamers and their allies wanted to start that day was with a prayer breakfast. And this was not some like political stunt. This was just how they authentically wanted to mark this day and call for justice, was in a way that was faith rooted. And so that's kind of, it's not sort of the way that I think that we usually think of faith being organized and sort of structured in these sort of set institutions that happen on Sundays or whatever holy day of the week. But it's really fascinating to see this organizing happening in this way.
And you hit on a very interesting point, this idea of what you particularly do, this creating of space in the progressive realm. Because, as I mentioned, we are at a point where there is a diametric opposition of folks who are also utilizing another idea of a la carte religion, which is going to their holy books and pulling out scriptures out of context and using it to support agendas, and for good or for bad. That's no judgment, but it also has made it very difficult for faith to exist in the progressive space, which is interesting because also the Tanenbaum also does medical training, which is a space where I don't think a lot of people understand there is a necessity for what I would say religious respect. And a lot of folks say religious tolerance, and I think that isn't really, and either one of you can elaborate on why that word sometimes isn't as helpful as I think people think it is. Okay. But these are two spaces that you both work in that folks are like, progressive, faith, medicine, religious respect.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about how both of you have been able to work in, and your organizations have been able to create this space, and why you feel it's important.
Okay, so first let me talk about tolerance, because I have very strong feelings about that. I have long thought of tolerance as this: I'll tolerate you. and that goes back years. And it is a starting point. It is a stepping stone toward respect. But respect is something qualitatively different. And so in all of the work that we do, which is trying to focus often on how we treat one another, and how do we treat one another respectfully? So you ask yourself the question, what does that look like in any particular environment? So in healthcare, if you think about going to the doctor, people very often, not always, but sometimes, will make a health decision based on the way they understand, believe, and practice their faith. So what does that look like? It can look like a Muslim woman, an older Muslim woman, being offered a heart valve and telling the doctor, no, thank you. And he looks at her and says, she's a woman of faith, she's covered, she must be ready to meet her maker, her fate. And that's the end of the conversation. But the reason she said it is because the valve is made of porcine, and she believes that's a sin. And there's a mechanical option, the mechanical valve. It's not discussed. Not only that, but no one is suggesting maybe she confer with her imam, just to see if perhaps in Islam, life is more important than the valve, which I believe it is. And so it comes up, and what we've done is identify 15 ways. We call them 15 trigger points that people make decisions in their health care, sometimes based on their faith. And what we do is we create training for current providers and also those who will be coming up in the ranks. We have medical school curricula. We just completed a curricula with Columbia School of Nursing for nurses. We have a residency curricula. And it's to train people how these things show up in their practices and how to ask to see if religion is influencing, or what someone believes about their religion is influencing a decision, and how they can then respond in a way to get them the best possible care. So it's an effort to improve patient care in the way that religion shows up in healthcare and creates a tension point, a conflict, an unknown, or sometimes a crisis.
And in my training in multi-faith chaplaincy in a hospital, my presence in the room was never to provide spiritual guidance or instruction, I guess is perhaps the better term. It was more to help the patients make meaning out of what was happening to them, whether that was out of a faith tradition or just however they were experiencing the world. How did it relate to their sudden illness or the death of a family member? How did that sort of align or misalign with their feelings about death and afterlife and fate and circumstance, and to really help them make meaning out of that situation? And there are ways that we're doing that constantly, and which faith is always, for those of us who are people of faith, it's always kind of how we are understanding and making meaning out of the world around us, and that includes the political space as well. And so I think that's one thing that we struggle with a bit often as progressives in particular, for those of us who are progressive, with this idea that our faith could show up in our politics in some way. But it is going to, if that's how we make meaning out of the world, if that's, what our worldview is like, we're going to understand public policy in terms of justice or compassion or whatever it is that those values of our faith are. And we also have to really value church-state separation and understand what that looks like and how to not weaponize religion so that it, in fact, infringes upon the religious freedom of others and ultimately of ourselves.
This sounds like both of you walk a very, very thin tightrope.
Well, we found that we've had to get involved in advocacy more on some of these issues. And I know that you've spoken out on healthcare as well, Maggie. There have been some regulations put in place that really raise, for me, the ultimate question that we're facing at this point in time in the 21st century in America, which is, whose religious freedom in a religiously plural society? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be the religious freedom of a segment of believers, possibly across certain traditions, but a segment of believers? Or is it going to be religious freedom for each of us and all of us, including non-believers? And how is that going to be put into practice to the greatest extent possible? Now, I've done a lot of thinking about this. I actually don't think you can do it perfectly, where everybody gets exactly what they want all the time. But there are ways to practice respect for the variety of beliefs and to create policies and practices where the most diverse set of beliefs gets accommodated to the greatest extent possible, most of the time, if not all of the time. And so we've seen some regulations in healthcare recently where we participated in amicus briefs against the regulations because they would have allowed the janitor, for example, to object to a procedure and refuse to clean the room so that the procedure would not go forward.
And I think that's an interesting segue into, in both your opinions, it appears to, let's lay it that way, that there's an increasing focus to unite communities, to bring people of faith together on these themes and moral guidelines. How have you seen this manifested in your work, and do you feel like this is a trend forward?
All right, let me try.
Sure.
We have found, and if you look, you will see that across traditions there are a lot of shared values that you can find in every tradition, like the Golden Rule: do unto others as you want them to do unto as they do, as you want them to do unto you. And you can use that to bring people together, to look at problems and try to solve them, common problems. To welcome the stranger, to do no harm to the stranger. You can bring people together around these traditions. It's not a brand new phenomenon, but it is one that is escalating, I think. And there are more people getting involved and more movements around this. So I think it is something that is growing. What do you think?
I think in this Trump era, there's absolutely a lot of movement toward communities coming together to fight what is essentially a common challenge on all sides. Mm-hmm. I also think that there is increasing polarization in our country, and we are not finding common cause often with folks on the other side. So I'm seeing kind of both happen simultaneously. I will say that while the so-called religious right is very monolithic in many ways, very white, very male-dominated, very Christian, very Protestant Christian. Progressive faith movements are extremely diverse religiously, racially, in every single way. And we have, I think, in these past 3 years, really lived into that diversity and really worked to find new ways of being allies to one another and supporting one another. And I do, that does bring me a lot of joy and hope.
There is something to really making the effort to talking with the people we don't talk with all the time, and the people we presume are just so different from us in the way they think and believe in their worldviews that there's nothing to share. And I've learned that through my work, and I've learned that through some of the people I've worked with who have shared the core values of finding a way to live respect and had fundamental, foundational differences rooted in faith from the way I view the world. And one of my very, very dear friends today is an evangelical Christian with whom I worked very closely, and we disagreed on a lot of stuff. But we talk to each other, and we talk about the news he watches and the news I watch, and the news I try to watch that I think he's watching, and he tells me which shows not to watch. He says, don't watch that one, no good. And we talk about ideas, and I try to understand, listen to what he's saying. And I really think that it's something we started calling radicalized respect. It's not only talking in our bubbles, but actually reaching out and really trying to be open to the fact that, there is divine, and I think there is divine in all of us. And so maybe there's more listening to do and more asking and more ways. There's maybe more common ground than we think.
I think that's actually a perfect segue to our next segment, to ask more questions and do more listening. I want to thank you both so much. I wish I had 30 more minutes so that we can continue this. But thank you so much. Can I have a round of applause for Maggie Siddiqi and Julie Dubensky. Thank you. Y'all were amazing. Thank you. All right, so we have one more panel coming up. I am very excited about this panel. We were talking a lot about nerd stuff in the back. Maybe that is going to bleed into this conversation. Maybe not. But I'd like to bring up to the stage Pam Grossman, the creator and host of the Witch Wave podcast and the author of the books Walking the Witch, Reflections of Women, Magic, and Power, and What is a Witch? And Dianca London Potts, who is a writer of all the things in all the places and has a book coming out that I'm very excited about.
Yes. Dianca is everywhere.
Dianca really is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Me and Dianca have written for the same publications before. We have both written for Rewire.
Yeah, we're like twins.
Yeah?
But not.
She's a little bit cooler than I am. It's fine. It's fine.
I think it's a tie. I mean, come on. Marvel Universe, come on.
That's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'll take it. So, look, last panel. You're going to get the question. The same question everyone's gotten before. I hope you weren't taking notes because no cheating. What does the word faith mean to you?
So I was thinking about this. I had some time. I could cheat. For me, I think it's a real hybrid of surrender and hope and trust, because you are trusting in something immaterial. Usually faith has an immaterial aspect to it that you can't quantify. It's really hard to put measurements around it, and yet you're practicing and believing anyway. So for me, it's a combination of all those juicy things.
I guess for me, I don't know, I'm like obsessed with like being autobiographical all of the time because I'm teaching nonfiction right now, and I feel like it's important to say that faith for me is a trigger in a way, because I grew up fundamentalist Christian, and the first Christian school that I went to was a fundamentalist Christian school in rural suburban PA. It's associated with Bob Jones University, which Bob Jones University is associated with the KKK directly. And that school is called Faith Christian Academy. So it's like faith to me. That was like my earliest connection to that. But now I think of this essay that I recently revisited by Alexander Chi, where he's writing about tarot and like his relationship with that. And he says at the end of the essay, there's this question, and the question is, what can you trust of what you can't see? And I feel like for me, that's where I'm at with faith now, of where does trust come from? Where does, so many of the things that you were saying, all the other panelists as well, but community, trust, support, love, healing, all of those things. How can you trust those things? How can you know that those things are real? And for me, I feel it's an experience, an embodiment, I think, when it comes to faith for me.
So both of you have very interesting journeys. You kind of teased that a little bit when it comes to religion versus practice versus faith. And I'm going to use this in the best terms possible because we also had a kind of conversation behind of this hodgepodge in a good way of being able to define who we are in our faith and our religion and our practice. For both of you, how do you personally identify your spiritual practice? And talk to us a little bit about how you got, we don't have like 3 hours, because I know these journeys are epic because they started in our 20s, and all journeys in your 20s are epic.
All caps.
Caps. But, how, as you tell us about your self-identification, talk to us a little bit about how you got to a point where you found the right balance between blank and blank.
Mm-hmm. So I was raised Jewish, but I'm now a Jewwitch. It's the ridiculous hybrid term a lot of us use, and we only say it half kiddingly. But essentially, Judaism is still part of my heritage. It's still part of my family and my history. So I haven't turned away from Judaism and towards something else, which I think is a lot of people's journeys when they identify as being a witch. That said, I'm also pagan, and using the word witch to describe myself and using witchcraft to describe what I practice is real, it's important to me, and it's given me a sense of centering and empowerment that's been very, very crucial for my self-development. And so the very miniature version of the question that you're asking is, I was a really weird kid who hung out a lot in the low end of the Dewey Decimal System at the library, where all the books on Bigfoot and dream interpretation and witches exist. And I loved mythology and magic, and fast forward to discovering spell books as a teenager. Fast forward again to discovering Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and this idea that actually religion and faith is this unified body that we all can have an inroad into. But in fact, we're more alike than we are different. And that allowed me to realize that becoming a witch, or identifying that I am a witch, is something that I think other people can relate to. They just use a different word. But for me, witchcraft is about embracing the feminine. It's about celebrating the body, nature, and about using the powers that I have to change myself and change the world.
That was so well said. I'm just like that.
It's like she has a podcast or something.
Yeah, it's like,
Do you do this often?
I mean,
Really
I try to
good.
get out.
I feel like to answer that, I'll try to be like very concise, because that is not my strength as a Gemini, or just a person. But I think it's very similar to what you were saying. Like, I also was that kid in the library with like the Bigfoot book and like the book on like, can you speak to spirits and all of these things. But also, like I said earlier, like I grew up very, very evangelical Christian, but at the intersection and overlap of white fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, but also the black version of that, which is more livelier, but still also potentially dangerous. And so I think that I was also kind of caught up in the way that, a sermon can entrance you, right? The way that, my mother can speak in tongues and like people believe in healing by just touching, right, and prayer. And to me, I felt like that seemed very similar to when I was reading my little YA books about like spells, or when you read in the Bible about women who were prophets, who dreamt dreams, right? So I think I was always kind of looking for the magic in whatever was there in front of me. And I think as someone coming out of that sort of community, where I was like baptized, depending on what you interpret as like, if you believe in infant baptism as counting, I was baptized 3 to 4 times throughout my whole life. And then going to Christian school for 2 years. And then even still after that, seeking community at like what I like to call hipster church in Philly. They're fine. I ended up leaving. But I feel like all these things I was looking for were very similar in the sense that I wanted a way to interact with community and faith and embodying my beliefs and also learning from others that allowed me to have that gray area of being able to question and not be rejected or be told that I was like an apostate or that I didn't believe anything at all or that I was immoral. And so I feel like for me, stepping very shyly out of the broom closet, as we all say on the interwebs, I don't know. I think that one of the things for me that has been a gift, wherever I end up on my journey, is that I can be in a space where things are in flux and there is no necessary like line of specificity or no dogmatic fundamental like if you're this you can't be that, because that's what I grew up in and it was very painful. So I think I really want to keep going with it to see where it leads me without knowing, because I think I was disallowed the ability to not know.
So this actually brings up a good question, and we talked about it because you're both in the same coven. And we talked about that there are differences in the way people practice, the words people use, the idea of witch and witchcraft, and how that molds and shifts based upon who you are and how you connect to things. Do you see, and if you don't, it's totally fine, you can say that, or feel that there is a difference between the idea of practice, religion, and faith?
I think that they're very interrelated, and I think anyone you ask is going to have probably a bit of a different answer. When it comes to witchcraft specifically, it's a really difficult thing to put language around because it's a beautiful path because it is decentralized and it's super personal, which is why I think more and more people are gravitating towards it today. But that also makes it so difficult to quantify. So, for example, Pew Research Center in 2014 has quantified that somewhere around 1.4 million Americans consider themselves pagan or Wiccan. And what's funny about that is Wiccanism is sometimes considered a form of paganism, pagan as the umbrella term under which Wiccan or just witch or druid, all of these other nature-based religions kind of fall, right? On the other hand, you have people like myself. I don't call myself Wiccan. I do call myself pagan. Calling myself a witch is as much an identifier and an archetype that I'm plugging into and identifying with as anything else. So I think it's really tricky to talk about in this context, but certainly practice, the spells that we cast, the rituals that we're doing is an embodied expression of this faith, which some might also call a religion. So that's my very wiggly, witchy answer for you.
I feel like in terms of that, I'm going to lean into like one of like 3 things I remember from math class. I'm a writer, I don't know. But like the idea of Venn diagrams with that overlap. And so when I think of the intersection of faith, religion, and practice, I think there are things that are on this side and also coincide that lead to the next. Either that being like religion and then faith and the overlap and then practice. Or maybe and then I'm like, oh, there's 3. So then maybe there's one here, and then they all interconnect in a way that probably ends up looking like that thing from the original Charmed. But at the same time, I think that's the point of it, and also it's like everyone has an individual journey and relationship to that too. So I think there's a nice way where there is this connective tissue that can oftentimes allow for us to create community around these things, even if we have different paths or different things that have shaped us that are outside of that overlap. And again, for me, I think one of the things that I love so much about witchcraft, although I do get really mad when a lot of my coworkers who are like more square, or as I like to say, normie, will say like, oh, you're in a coven, are you Wiccan? And I get like so mad. In the same way that I get mad when people think I know every Black person in Brooklyn.
You don't?
I don't. There's one that I'm missing. No, I don't know. But I do feel like I like, again, that there is this elasticity or this allowance of unfixed definition, whether that definition is through practice, faith, or religion, because again, the danger that I see, and I think this echoes through what everyone has said so far with each panel, is fundamentalism. Because when it's like we have to have these fixed definitions, that is absolutely going to lead to violence.
So this is interesting because this goes back to the conversation we were having a little bit earlier about this idea of being a decentralized, quote unquote, unorganized religion. We'll just use that term right now. And what that means for people who consider themselves witches. I mean, even Wicca, voodoo on a certain level, Santeria on a certain level, there's still organized pieces of it. Do you feel like there's still a sense of fellowship in that deorganized, decentralized space, and why?
I absolutely do. I think that modern witchcraft is one of the spiritual practices that the internet has really helped. And I know that, we all have very mixed feelings about social media and the pros and cons of it. But one of the beautiful things is it's taken a practice or a path that's been so stigmatized and misunderstood to the point of shaming people and keeping them quiet and keeping them private in their practice. And it's allowed for us to celebrate each other, find each other, learn from each other, and empower each other to then step out of that broom closet, as Dianca was saying. So I find that to be really exciting, although it also brings a whole host of problems. So some of the other paths and religions you just mentioned, for example, in the modern witchcraft community, there's a lot of debate around cultural appropriation and around what it means to be a white witch versus a witch of color. And can white witches do things like burn sage, which is an indigenous practice? Or can we also, learn voodoo, right? Or hoodoo, which are African diaspora practices. So there's a lot of messiness, but the beauty of the modern witchcraft movement is that it's very intersectional and there's a lot of dialogue happening that I find to be so enlivening and helps us all evolve.
Yeah, I think, again, I agree. But I also think the part that I was thinking about while you were talking, and in relation to answering the question with dialogue, I think that dialogue means investment. It means intention. It means listening, not always talking. It means holding space, and it's an embodied experience, whether that happens in like a digital space or, in spaces like this, or in spaces like when we meet with our Coven sisters for Circle. Like, I feel like that's something that I spent so much time at church. I feel like I don't have to go until I'm like 90. So like, I feel like of all the spaces I've been in, when it was most real, when it was holy, in the same way that I feel like when we are together, it's holy, it's sacred, it's connected. It was because of the intention of hearing and holding space for each other. And so I feel like although it is messy and it is complicated and there might be people from very different paths all kind of bumping into each other, and I feel like it's just that willingness and that commitment to honor that difference and to maybe learn something from it, even if it doesn't mean that then you start, doing different things with your altar or carving a candle a certain way that's not what you used to do. I think it's all about having the willingness to let it not be one thing.
And it seems like there is this other space that folks don't talk about, which is people can be a witch and be Jewish. People can practice voodoo and be Catholic. These spaces that coexist within this dialogue. But it seems like witchcraft has routinely been condemned by organized religion and by religious leaders for centuries, right? We were having a conversation about the Salem witch trials, which, for the record, none of the people killed in the Salem witch trials were actually witches. Witches didn't go to Salem until the 1970s. And so you have these interesting concepts of witchcraft being threatening. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's been such a threat to more traditional faith communities?
Well, there's a very long history of people using the word witch to demonize the other, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, people of other religions. So there's a lot of misogyny and racism that's baked into the word witch. It was almost always used as a negative epithet to shame or silence people who made others feel uncomfortable. And in the 15th century, with the advent of the printing press, you suddenly had all these witch hunting manuals that were being printed. And, you know, I think Christianity is such a beautiful religion, but there is a history of a certain segment of Christianity that intentionally started to marry together ideas of diabolism and devilry with witchcraft. And that
Which isn't true.
Correct. Most witches, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but most of us are not hanging out with the devil or demons.
We make really good snack spreads. Tell you that much.
Exactly. Although, you know, I often say the Satanists I've met are very, very nice.
Best hugs.
Most
Best
of them
hugs.
are like radical feminists, and they're using Satan as this, like, you know, symbol for kind of an anti-patriarchal symbol, and it's not literal at all. So that's a whole nother topic, but you know, when it comes to witchcraft, this marrying together of witches who usually would be shown as women, you know, between 75 and 85% of the people killed during the witch hunts of certainly Europe, later in America. And these witch hunts are still happening in places today in Papua New Guinea and sub-Saharan Africa and lots of other places. It's almost always a majority of women who are condemned and killed. And so, you know, is it only propaganda and misogyny that caused this? No, there are certainly other threads, but it was a big, big part of it for sure.
Yeah. I feel like one thing that I always think, I don't know why I call it, it's not branding, right? But it kind of is. I feel like it's just like a really long invested, like deeply researched, like branding project for like the whatever the right ever was. I always think of Puritans as like, if they were here now, they'd probably love Fox News. And I just feel like that. I feel like it's just the thing is why people are uncomfortable by it, why it was vilified, why it still is vilified. Even when people kind of dip a toe into, like maybe they get their first like crystal or they like pick up a tarot deck at Urban Outfitters. We've all been there. Like, I feel like there's this way where people don't want to like fully own it. And I too like deal with that, not wanting to fully own it because there is a certain like stigma around it. But I think the stigma comes from this fear of a thing that is not traditional, that is not predominant. And then I remind myself, it's like, I'm a Black woman. So like, go for it, right? Because it's like, I also, as a Black person, as a Black body, hold a history within me that has always been vilified, that has also been oftentimes also synonymous. We were talking earlier about Tituba, the way that not being what is seen as aspirational or what is seen as safe or what is seen as a form of power that is ruling power can oftentimes then lead to, you know, being vilified in the way that witchcraft has been.
And I think I kind of want to close with this question because there's this underlying thread of empowerment and this underlying thread of self-direction that I'm hearing, and this concept of being able to take hold of your faith, being able to take hold of how you practice. In saying that, and kind of going full circle back to this post-industrial revolution, technology is everywhere, this ever-increasing news cycle 24/7. Do you feel like things like witchcraft, like decentralized practices or religion or faiths, however they're defined, are uniquely well suited to kind of address some of the issues and conflicts that we're seeing right now, in particular, how diametrically opposed the country seems to be at times?
Mm-hmm. I certainly do. I don't think it's for everybody. And for those who might be listening, who really love whatever religion they were raised in, if that works for you and that makes you feel seen and empowered, and if it inspires you to do good in the world, great. Like, we're not looking to convert anybody. We're not recruiting, we're not evangelizing. That said, what I think is particularly beautiful about the path that we walk is that it does honor the feminine in a way that most of the religions traditionally just don't have in their texts. And I know it exists a bit, but if you think about who the heroes are of a lot of our oldest religions, or our most famous popular religions, it's usually a male god, a male hero, a male who dies and then is resurrected. And of course, there are powerful female figures as well, but they don't seem to be as focused or celebrated. The other thing about this path is it really does honor the body, any body. It honors sexuality and sensuality as something to not be ashamed of. It honors nature, and my goodness, we need to re-enchant this earth because we need to fall in love with it enough that we want to save it and rescue it. So I think that there are a number of reasons why more people are walking this path. And I think the fact that it is so personal is something people are really, really looking for. Many of us are tired of these dogmas that are handed to us that we're not allowed to question and we're not allowed to personalize. Whereas, the path that we walk is something that is so meaningful and self-defining and empowering.
Yeah. I think I definitely agree with that. And I also feel like for me, I think that it does work because it dismantles and then it restructures and then it can reform in whatever it needs to be, depending on who you're sitting in circle with, depending on what conversation you're having, depending on what DM of like a spell or a poem you're sending to someone on a day when they need it. And I feel like it's not looking for external support in the terms of something that's above you, that's beyond you. It's looking for things that are more lateral, that are like kind of like person to person. In the same way that like I don't trust the president. I don't trust like old modes of religion that won't allow for us to kind of circle back and realize that we have power within ourselves, that we can heal each other, that we can be in community and still practice those traditional things that many folks are into, definitely have shaped me as well, but that it isn't like kind of cutting yourself off from your body or from your heart or from your mind in the way that so many other, particularly like Western religions do. And so I think that it's important in the sense that it's letting us kind of conjure our power together and to realize that we have the tools that we need and we don't have to like export it to our guy hero, whoever that might be.
Well, that is a perfect way to end the show. I hope that we left you with more questions than you came in with. That was the point. Thank you so much, Dianca. Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you to all the panelists this evening for letting me pick their brains. I'm sure some of them are like, don't ask me that question again. And thank all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.